Or there comes a moment when repetition becomes impossible to ignore. Not because the circumstances are new, but because the pattern has existed for too long. A cycle that once felt temporary begins to reveal itself as something deeper, something repeated often enough that it starts shaping expectation. This is how scarcity becomes powerful. Not only through lack itself, but through repetition of lack. Repeated financial pressure, repeated instability, repeated seasons where effort feels present, but lasting increase feels absent. At first, these experiences are interpreted as isolated moments. A difficult season, a temporary setback, a period of adjustment. But when similar patterns continue appearing across time, something changes internally. Temporary experiences begin to feel permanent. And once permanence is assumed, expectation begins to shift. Expectation is powerful because it influences behavior long before outcomes are visible. What is expected to shape decisions? It affects risk tolerance, long-term thinking, confidence, and willingness to plan beyond immediate needs. When scarcity is expected, behavior often contracts. Thinking becomes short-term. Decisions become reactive. Focus narrows to survival. This is understandable because repeated instability trains perception to prioritize immediate protection over long-term structure. And over time, this creates an invisible system. A system where scarcity is no longer just an external condition, it becomes internalized as normal. This is the real danger, because once scarcity feels normal, it stops being questioned. Limitation begins to feel natural. Instability begins to feel expected. Insufficiency begins to feel familiar, and familiarity lowers resistance. What is familiar is often accepted without conscious awareness. It becomes the background assumption beneath decisions, goals, and expectations. This is how patterns sustain themselves. Not only through external repetition, but through internal agreement. Once internal agreement forms, the cycle strengthens because behavior begins aligning with expectation. If instability is expected, planning may remain limited. If insufficiency is expected, opportunities may be approached cautiously or avoided entirely. If limitation is assumed, growth may feel unrealistic even when available. This is why Psalm 112 begins where it does. Blessed is the man who fears the Lord, who delights greatly in his commandments. The first word is significant. Blessed. The psalm does not begin with lack. It does not begin with struggle. It does not begin with scarcity. It begins with a different framework entirely. A framework of alignment. This is critical because sustainable transformation does not begin with money alone. Or resources without structure rarely produce lasting change. Temporary increase without internal alignment often creates temporary relief, not permanent transformation. True change begins with foundation. A new internal order. Alignment means shifting what defines perception. Instead of being defined by repeated lack, identity becomes connected to a higher structure. Instead of interpreting life primarily through scarcity patterns, perception begins to reorganize around principles of stability, wisdom, and order. This is the beginning of interruption. Because patterns are rarely broken externally first, they are interrupted internally before they are replaced externally. The moment scarcity is no longer treated as identity, its authority begins to weaken. This does not mean circumstances change instantly. It means interpretation changes first. And interpretation is everything. If circumstances remain difficult but identity is no longer shaped by scarcity, behavior begins to change. Planning changes, emotional response changes. Decision-making begins to shift from reaction to intention. This is the beginning of structural transformation. Scarcity thrives where there is no alternative framework, but Psalm 112 introduces one. A life organized by principles stronger than instability. A structure where order replaces chaos. Where discipline replaces reaction. Or where long-term alignment begins to override short-term pressure. This is why delighting commandments is emphasized. Commandments represent order, not restriction for its own sake, but structure designed to create stability. Because without structure, increase is difficult to sustain. Structure organizes resources. Structure protects momentum. Structure creates continuity. This is how cycles begin to change, not by hoping repetition ends on its own, but by introducing a stronger pattern capable of replacing the old one. This is the true meaning of scarcity, no longer feeling normal. It is the moment awareness shifts, the moment limitation is no longer passively accepted, the moment instability is no longer treated as identity, the moment repetition is recognized as a pattern rather than destiny. And once that recognition occurs, something powerful begins. Internal agreement with scarcity starts to break. Expectation begins to change. Behavior begins to reorganize. Thought patterns begin to shift. Because what was once normalized is now being questioned. And what is questioned can be interrupted. This is the hook of Psalm 112. Not simply a promise of increase, but a redefinition of identity. A shift from survival-based expectation to alignment-based structure. A recognition that repeated lack does not have to define future outcomes. Because what has been repeated can be interrupted. And what is interrupted can be replaced. This is where transformation begins, not with external abundance first, but with the internal decision that scarcity is no longer normal, no longer identity, and no longer the unquestioned framework through which life is interpreted. His descendants will be mighty on earth. The generation of the upright will be blessed. Psalm 112 immediately shifts the focus beyond temporary survival and into continuity. This is important because many people think only in terms of immediate relief when facing cycles of scarcity. The first instinct is often to escape present pressure, reduce current instability, or solve the most urgent need. And while immediate relief is important, Psalm 112 introduces a larger vision, not just surviving one difficult season, not just escaping one temporary challenge, but building something stable enough to continue. This is the language of legacy. Legacy is often misunderstood as wealth passed forward, but in a deeper sense, legacy is structure that outlasts one moment. It is continuity of strength, wisdom, discipline, and order that remains effective across time. This is what makes the verse powerful. His descendants will be mighty on earth. Mighty suggests strength, capacity, stability, and influence. It reflects more than mere existence, or it points to thriving within structure. This matters because scarcity often narrows thinking towards short-term management. When instability is repeated, attention naturally becomes focused on the present. How to manage current needs, how to reduce immediate pressure, how to maintain stability one step at a time. And while these concerns are real, a purely short-term mindset can unintentionally reinforce cycles, because what is only managed today may return tomorrow if no deeper structure changes. This is why Psalm 112 expands the perspective. It asks a deeper question. What is being built that continues beyond the immediate moment? This question changes everything, because once the focus moves from temporary relief to continuity, decisions begin to shift. Short-term thinking often prioritizes urgency. Long-term thinking prioritizes structure. Urgency solves immediate problems. Structure prevents repeated problems. This distinction is crucial. Without structure, relief is temporary. A moment of increase without discipline may disappear. A temporary improvement without systems may not sustain itself. External change without internal order often struggles to remain stable. But when structure is built, continuity becomes possible. This is why legacy begins with systems. Systems of discipline, systems of stewardship, systems of thought and behavior aligned with long-term stability. Legacy is rarely accidental. It is built through repeated patterns that reinforce strength over time. Consistent habits, intentional decisions, organized priorities. These create predictability, and predictability creates stability. This is what allows strength to continue beyond one isolated season. The generation of the upright will be blessed. That again, the focus is continuity. A generation is not a moment. It represents extension. It reflects what continues because a stronger pattern has been established. This is deeply important in the context of breaking scarcity. Because breaking scarcity is not only about receiving more, it is about ensuring that increase is supported by patterns strong enough to preserve it. Otherwise, cycles repeat. This is why many patterns continue across time, not because change is impossible, but because structures remain unchanged. Patterns are inherited not only through circumstances, but through systems. Ways of thinking, ways of responding to pressure, ways of handling resources, ways of interpreting opportunity. These are often more powerful than individual moments of gain or loss. And this is why Psalm 112 emphasizes uprightness. Uprightness here represents alignment. It is the commitment to order strong enough to support continuity, because continuity requires consistency. What is inconsistent is difficult to sustain, or what is unstructured is difficult to preserve. But what is organized through aligned principles creates durability. This is how legacy is built, not through one dramatic moment, but through repeated consistency over time. A stronger pattern replacing an old one. And once a stronger pattern is established, repetition begins working in a new direction. Instead of repeated instability, there is repeated discipline. Instead of repeated lack, there is repeated stewardship. Instead of repeated reaction, there is repeated intentionality. This is the shift from cycle to structure. And structure is what changes outcomes long term. This changes the way success itself is understood. Success is no longer only immediate gain. It becomes sustainable order. Not only what can be achieved, but what can be maintained. This is maturity of perspective. Because true stability is measured not only by increase, but by continuity of increase supported by wisdom. This is what creates strength that lasts. And once this perspective is adopted, something significant changes internally. Decision-making becomes less emotional. Planning becomes more intentional. Choices begin reflecting future continuity, not only present urgency. This is the mindset of legacy. Not asking only, how do I solve today? But also asking, what am I building that remains effective tomorrow? What pattern am I reinforcing? What structure am I creating that can outlast current conditions? These questions shift behavior toward continuity. And continuity is the foundation of lasting stability. This is the deeper message of Psalm 112 in this section. True transformation is not only about ending one cycle, it is about establishing a stronger one. A new pattern, a new structure, a new system of alignment capable of producing stability beyond the present moment. Because what is built with intention can outlast what was inherited by repetition. And once a stronger structure is in place, legacy begins not as theory, but as continuity of stability strong enough to extend beyond the current moment into lasting order. Wealth and riches will be in his house, and his righteousness endures forever. Psalm 112 does not avoid the subject of resources. It addresses it directly. This is important because many discussions about prosperity remain abstract, focusing only on ideas of blessing, while ignoring the practical reality that resources matter. Stability is not built on concepts alone. Financial pressure is real. Material needs are real. The ability to create, preserve, and manage resources is part of functional stability. And Psalm 112 acknowledges this clearly. Wealth and riches will be in his house. This statement introduces material increase, but it is positioned carefully. Wealth is mentioned after alignment. Resources are introduced after structure. Increase follows order. This sequence matters because resources without structure often create temporary change, not lasting transformation. A sudden increase without discipline can disappear quickly. An opportunity without preparation may not be sustained. Access without stewardship often creates instability rather than continuity. This is why Psalm 112 connects wealth with righteousness. And his righteousness endures forever. Righteousness here is not merely moral language, it reflects order, alignment, and consistent structure. It is the stabilizing framework that allows increase to endure rather than evaporate. This is the difference between accumulation and sustainability. Accumulation is obtaining resources. Sustainability is maintaining and multiplying them through structure. Many focus entirely on accumulation while ignoring the systems necessary to preserve what is gained. But preservation is essential. Without preservation, increase is temporary. Without structure, progress becomes fragile. This is why the house is mentioned. A house represents more than a building. It symbolizes system, environment, and organization. Resources in a house suggest stability within structure, not scattered increase or not chaotic access, not unmanaged opportunity, but resources integrated into an ordered framework. This is what makes wealth functional, because wealth is not simply possession. It is capacity supported by management. Resources become valuable when they are organized toward purpose, when they are protected through discipline, when they are aligned with long-term continuity rather than short-term impulse. This is where many systems fail, not because increase is impossible, but because structure is insufficient. A lack of organization weakens sustainability. A lack of discipline disrupts continuity. A lack of intentionality creates leakage. And leakage is often more destructive than lack, because increase can exist while stability remains absent if systems are weak. This is why right structure matters. Right structure organizes flow. It determines how resources enter, how they are managed, how they are preserved, and how they are directed. Without this, increase becomes unpredictable. But with structure, resources begin serving stability instead of creating volatility. This changes the emotional relationship with finances as well. When resources are unmanaged, uncertainty increases. When uncertainty increases, emotional reactivity often follows. Decisions become fear-based, urgent, or inconsistent. But when structure exists, emotional pressure decreases. There is greater clarity or greater predictability, greater stability in decision-making. This is one of the hidden powers of order. Order reduces chaos, and reduced chaos increases strategic capacity. This is why wealth under right structure is so different from random increase. It is calmer, less reactive, less unstable, less dependent on unpredictable cycles. Instead, it reflects continuity. This continuity is what Psalm 112 emphasizes. Righteousness endures forever. Again, endurance is the key. The goal is not merely access, it is continuity of access supported by enduring structure. This means thinking differently about resources. Not only asking, how do I get more? But also asking, how do I organize what I already have? What systems support sustainability? What habits reinforce continuity rather than instability? These questions reflect structural thinking, and structural thinking changes outcomes over time. Because small repeated systems often matter more than isolated moments of increase. Repeated discipline compounds. Repeated stewardship compounds. Repeated intentionality compounds. This is how stability is built. Not through one event, but through ongoing alignment. And alignment reduces waste. Not only material waste, but cognitive waste. Less decision fatigue. Less emotional volatility. Less reactive pressure. This creates more capacity for growth. Or, because energy is no longer constantly redirected toward correcting preventable instability. Instead, energy can be invested strategically. This is how wealth becomes part of a stable system rather than an unstable cycle. It is integrated into order. This is the deeper message of Psalm 112 in this section. Resources are not isolated from spiritual or structural principles. They are connected to them. Increase is strongest when supported by alignment. Access is most effective when protected by discipline. Opportunity is most sustainable when organized intentionally. This is what creates enduring stability. And once this is understood, the mindset around wealth begins to shift. Resources are no longer viewed only as solutions to immediate pressure. They become tools within a larger framework of continuity, organization, and long-term stability. This changes everything because the focus is no longer only on acquiring more, it is on becoming structured enough to sustain what comes. And when structure is strong, increase no longer feels temporary or fragile. It begins to feel integrated, stable, protected, and aligned with a system capable of supporting lasting growth rather than repeating old patterns of instability. He will not be afraid of evil tidings. His heart is steadfast, trusting. Psalm 112 now moves from external resources to internal condition. This shift is essential. Because financial instability is not only a material issue, it often becomes an emotional and psychological one. Repeated pressure shapes more than circumstances. Over time, it can begin shaping thought patterns, emotional responses, and decision-making habits. This is how scarcity expands its influence. It does not remain outside. It enters internally. Repeated financial pressure can gradually produce a state of hyper-awareness toward threat, a constant focus on what could go wrong, a heightened sensitivity to uncertainty, an internal expectation that disruption may be near. This is understandable because repeated instability trains the nervous system to anticipate pressure, and anticipation changes behavior. When loss is expected, caution increases. When uncertainty dominates perception, decisions become reactive. When instability feels familiar, calm becomes difficult to sustain. This is how scarcity creates internal instability, even when circumstances temporarily improve. External conditions may shift, but internal patterns often remain active. And this is why Psalm 112 addresses the heart. He will not be afraid. Fear here is not simply momentary emotion. It represents a pattern of internal response to uncertainty. Fear narrows focus. It prioritizes immediate survival over strategic thinking. It amplifies urgency. It reduces cognitive flexibility. This matters because sustainable growth requires clarity. And clarity is difficult to maintain under chronic fear. When fear dominates, attention becomes fragmented. Thought loops increase. Worst-case scenarios become more prominent. Decision-making becomes emotionally loaded. This often leads to short-term decisions that reduce immediate discomfort but may weaken long-term stability. This is why emotional steadiness is a structural advantage. A steadfast heart is not passive. It is stable under pressure. Steadfastness means internal consistency, even when external conditions are uncertain. This does not mean ignoring challenges. It means not allowing uncertainty to dictate internal state. This distinction is powerful. External pressure may exist, but internal collapse is not required. This is what Psalm 112 emphasizes. A heart that remains stable preserves decision quality. When internal stability is strong, choices become more intentional. Planning becomes more strategic. Emotional energy is conserved rather than depleted by constant reaction. This creates an enormous advantage over time because instability compounds when decisions are repeatedly made under panic. But calm also compounds. Repeated calm responses create stronger patterns, clearer thinking, more measured action, greater consistency. This is how internal structure begins to replace reactive cycles. Evil. His heart is steadfast. Heart here symbolizes center of orientation, what stabilizes thought, emotion, and direction. A steadfast center creates resilience, not because challenges disappear, but because internal order remains intact. This is crucial in financial environments. Resources fluctuate, markets change, unexpected expenses arise, timing shifts, external uncertainty is often unavoidable. But internal instability does not need to mirror every external fluctuation. This is maturity, not expecting life to remove all uncertainty, but building enough internal structure to remain functional within it. This changes the entire experience of pressure. Pressure no longer automatically produces panic. Uncertainty no longer automatically produces fear-based reaction. Instead, response becomes more grounded. This is what trust enables. Trust is often misunderstood as passivity, but here it reflects stability of orientation. Trust reduces fragmentation. Instead of constantly shifting emotionally with every variable, trust creates continuity, a stable internal anchor. This allows focus to remain broader than immediate pressure. And broader focus is critical, because scarcity thinking narrows perception. It makes everything feel urgent, immediate, and threatening. But trust reopens perspective. It allows longer-term thinking, or it supports disciplined behavior under temporary uncertainty. It protects against impulsive reaction. This is one of the most practical advantages of internal steadiness. A calm mind can see options fear often obscures. A regulated emotional state can evaluate more clearly. And clarity improves outcomes. This is why becoming unshaken is not only emotional strength, that is strategic strength. The less internal volatility exists, the less energy is wasted managing unnecessary emotional disruption. That energy can instead be directed toward planning, building, organizing, and executing. This creates momentum, not frantic movement, but stable progress. And stable progress is more sustainable than emotionally reactive acceleration. This is the deeper lesson of this section. Financial stability is strengthened not only by external increase, but by internal regulation. Because resources can improve while instability remains if fear patterns continue governing behavior. But once internal steadiness develops, everything changes. Pressure loses some of its psychological control. Uncertainty loses some of its emotional intensity. Decision-making becomes less fear-driven. This restores agency. No longer reacting automatically to every fluctuation. No longer allowing uncertainty to dictate identity or emotional climate. Instead, there is steadiness. A heart that remains anchored, or a mind that remains clear. A system that does not collapse every time external pressure increases. And this is what Psalm 112 reveals. Lasting stability is not only built through resources, it is built through a heart structured strongly enough to remain unshaken when pressure attempts to create internal chaos. Because once the inside is stable, the outside becomes easier to organize, manage, and navigate with wisdom strong enough to outlast temporary uncertainty. He has dispersed abroad. He has given to the poor. His righteousness endures forever. Psalm 112 introduces a principle here that often seems counterintuitive in the context of scarcity. Flow. Scarcity naturally creates contraction. When resources feel limited, the instinct is often preservation through tightening, holding more closely, restricting movement, minimizing perceived risk by increasing control over every available resource. This response is understandable. Scarcity trains the mind toward protection. When repeated lack has been experienced, the system learns caution. It begins associating release with vulnerability and holding with safety. But over time, excessive contraction can create another form of limitation. Not because caution is inherently wrong, but because fear-based contraction changes the relationship with resources. Resources become emotionally loaded. Or, instead of being tools managed strategically, they begin carrying disproportionate psychological weight. Every decision feels heavier. Every release feels riskier. Every form of movement feels more threatening. This is where scarcity mindset often reinforces itself. Not only through lack, but through rigidity. Rigidity reduces adaptability. And adaptability is essential for healthy systems. This is why Psalm 112 introduces movement. He has dispersed abroad. This language reflects distribution, not reckless loss, not unstructured release, not careless depletion, but intentional movement. This distinction matters. Healthy systems are rarely static. They move. Breathing requires movement. Circulation requires movement. Growth requires movement. And resources often function similarly. When everything becomes psychologically frozen, flexibility decreases. But healthy flow introduces trust in process, structure, and continuity. This does not mean giving without wisdom. It means refusing to allow fear to become the sole governing principle of resource behavior. Because fear distorts decision-making. Fear can make holding feel like the only form of safety. But excessive holding without movement can create stagnation. And stagnation produces its own form of instability. A stagnant system often becomes rigid, brittle, and less responsive to changing conditions. But movement preserves adaptability. This is one of the hidden powers of generosity. Generosity is not only about other set, it's also about internal freedom. It disrupts fear-based contraction. It weakens the belief that safety exists only in total control. It reinforces a healthier relationship with resources. One where resources are managed intentionally, not emotionally worshipped or fearfully clung to. This is psychologically significant because scarcity often creates emotional fusion with resources. Resources begin representing safety, identity, worth, or certainty at levels beyond their practical function. This increases anxiety. Any fluctuation feels personally destabilizing, but generosity introduces separation. It reminds the system that resources are tools, useful, important, valuable, but not ultimate sources of identity or control. This creates emotional flexibility, and emotional flexibility supports better decision making. A mind less governed by fear sees more clearly. A system less trapped in contraction can respond more intelligently. This is why flow matters. Flow creates continuity. Not merely material continuity, but psychological continuity. It reinforces abundance at the level of orientation. Not naive abundance disconnected from reality, but grounded abundance rooted in trust, stewardship, and intentional circulation. This is a mature relationship with resources. Neither reckless nor rigid. Neither impulsive nor frozen, but balanced, capable of holding and releasing wisely. This balance is powerful because systems become stronger when they can both preserve and circulate effectively. Preservation alone is incomplete. Movement alone is incomplete. Strength requires both. This is what Psalm 112 models. A person aligned with order is not trapped in scarcity psychology. Resources are managed with wisdom and allowed to move within intentional structure. This movement creates flow, and flow reduces fear because repeated healthy movement demonstrates something important. Release does not automatically equal loss. Movement does not automatically equal depletion. Distribution does not automatically destroy stability. These realizations weaken scarcity conditioning. Over time, the nervous system begins to relate differently to resources. Less panic, less rigidity, less hyper-control, more trust in structure, more confidence in stewardship, more emotional regulation around movement. This is freedom, not necessarily from all financial pressure instantly, but from psychological captivity to scarcity patterns. And this freedom changes everything, because when fear loosens its grip, decision quality improves. Planning becomes more rational. Generosity becomes possible without panic. Or resource management becomes less emotionally exhausting. This creates healthier momentum. And momentum matters because stagnation often feels safe but rarely produces growth. Movement, when guided by wisdom, creates continuity. This is why the verse ends with endurance again. His righteousness endures forever. Order remains central. Generosity without order can become instability, but generosity within order creates healthy circulation. This is sustainable flow. Resources moving through a stable system, not trapped, not chaotic, but directed intentionally. This is the deeper message of this section. True abundance is not merely possession. It is freedom from fear-based rigidity. It is the ability to manage resources with wisdom, circulate them intentionally, and remain internally stable whether holding or releasing. Because once resources are no longer governed primarily by fear, something powerful happens. Tightness begins to relax. Rigidity begins to soften. And scarcity loses another layer of control. What replaces it is healthier flow, structured, intentional, and aligned with a system strong enough to sustain movement without collapsing into fear or instability. This is where reflection becomes decision, because awareness without action changes very little. Patterns do not disappear simply because they are recognized. Recognition is the beginning, but interruption requires intentional replacement. A repeated cycle continues until a stronger pattern is introduced. This is why Psalm 112 is not only descriptive, it is instructional. It does not merely describe stability. It reveals the structure behind it, and structure requires participation. If scarcity has repeated long enough to feel familiar, then familiarity itself must be challenged. Not emotionally, not impulsively, but systematically, because patterns are systems. Repeated instability is rarely random. It is often maintained by repeated thoughts, repeated reactions, repeated habits, and repeated structures that reinforce similar outcomes over time. This is why lasting change must be deeper than temporary motivation. Motivation is useful, but insufficient. A single emotional moment cannot replace an entire pattern. What replaces patterns is consistency. Repeated aligned decisions, repeated disciplined behavior, repeated intentional structure. This is how new systems are built. And building a new system begins with refusal. Refusal to normalize what should be interrupted. Do not normalize instability as identity. Do not normalize limitation as inevitability. Do not normalize repeated scarcity as permanent inheritance. Normalization is powerful because what is normalized is rarely challenged, but what is challenged becomes interruptible. Or, this is the first decision. Scarcity is no longer accepted as the unquestioned framework. This internal refusal matters because what is internally accepted is often externally reinforced through behavior. But once internal agreement changes, external behavior can begin to reorganize. This is when new structure begins. A stronger system replacing an older one. This is not built through dramatic change alone. It is often built through smaller repeated changes that compound over time. A stronger planning habit, a more intentional decision process, a healthier relationship with resources, a more disciplined response to pressure. These may seem small in isolation, but systems are built through repetition, and repetition compounds. Just as old patterns were reinforced repeatedly, new patterns must also be reinforced repeatedly. This is how interruption becomes replacement. Old cycles weaken through disuse. New structures strengthen through repetition. This process requires patience because deeply familiar patterns often resist immediate change. The mind may default toward old reactions. Emotion may pull toward familiar responses. Pressure may tempt short-term thinking. This is normal. But temporary discomfort does not mean the new structure is failing. It often means the old system is no longer being reinforced automatically. This is part of transition. And transition requires consistency. Continue building even when the new pattern still feels unfamiliar, because familiarity is not proof of correctness. Many limiting systems feel familiar precisely because they were repeated, not because they were effective. This is why intentional repetition matters. Repeat what strengthens stability. Repeat what builds clarity. Repeat what reinforces stewardship. Repeat what supports long-term continuity. These repetitions create a different future, not instantly but progressively. This is the power of systems. Small aligned actions, repeated consistently, eventually become structural. And structure is what changes outcomes sustainably. This is also where identity begins to shift. No longer identifying through old patterns. No longer viewing instability as default. No longer expecting limitation as the baseline framework. Instead, identity begins reorganizing around alignment. A person building stability. A system organized around continuity. A life increasingly structured by intentionality rather than reaction. This is the deeper transformation. Not merely escaping one difficult condition, but becoming structurally different. This matters because external improvement without internal restructuring often recreates old cycles. But internal restructuring changes the pattern itself. And when the pattern changes, repetition begins working in a new direction. Instead of repeated scarcity, repeated stability. Instead of repeated reaction, repeated discipline. Instead of repeated anxiety, repeated intentionality. This is what eventually creates a different lived reality, not magic, structure. This is the call of Psalm 112. Build what can outlast pressure. Build what can continue under uncertainty. Build what does not collapse because circumstances fluctuate. A stronger internal and external framework. So the final call is clear. Break agreement with old cycles. Interrupted, repeated limitation. Replace inherited instability with intentional order. Begin building systems that support continuity. Not only what solves today, but what strengthens tomorrow. Because what is repeated can be changed. And once repetition changes, outcomes begin to follow. This is how patterns are broken, not through wishful thinking, but through deliberate replacement with stronger systems, repeated long enough to become the new normal. And once the new normal is established, what once felt inevitable begins to lose all authority. Scarcity no longer defines expectation. Instability no longer defines identity. And the future is no longer governed by inherited repetition, but by a new structure strong enough to create lasting stability, sustainable growth, and continuity far beyond the old cycle.